Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the 2020 edition of Inside the Psychologist Studio. This is an unusual episode because we were forced to cancel the 2020 in-person convention. APS is really honored and pleased to welcome Dr. George Bonanno to the 2020 episode of Inside the Psychologist Studio. George is a psychologist who studies resilience and flexibility, and his research has profoundly impacted the lives of people all over the world. George completed his undergraduate degree at Hampshire College, and he completed his PhD in clinical psychology at Yale University. And for the past 20 years, George has been on faculty in the Department of Counseling and Clinical Psychology at Columbia University Teachers College. Like all of the colleagues who have appeared in this interview series, George is an international leader in his field of research, and he has produced mountains of published papers, and he has mountains of awards. One of the perks of being APS president is that you get to choose who you interview for Inside the Psychologist Studio. And so when I was president, I thought, well, who would I really like to interview? And I thought about all of the people whose work I really admire, my personal heroes in psychological science. Any of those people would be really fun to listen to and talk to. And I thought about some of the people who I'd really like to interview who I disagree with, because that could also be really fun, a really fun conversation. And then I thought about, well, over the past decades of my career, who have I actually had the most fun and interesting conversations with? Who have I learned the most from? Who has prompted me to think in ways that I might not otherwise think? And my first thought went to George. George's work is radical in some ways. He has taken a deeply held belief about how humans deal with adversity and trauma, and he has really provided us with a different narrative, a new story based on decades of really remarkable and groundbreaking research. What you can find in George's work are real insights into how people deal successfully with the difficulties that befall them. And I think his work is particularly timely at this moment in history, at this moment in our lives, when on any given day, it can feel as if the world is burning down around us, sometimes not even metaphorically. So it's with great pleasure and a real honor that I welcome George Bonanno to our discussion today.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you for inviting me for this. I'm very happy to be here.
So, George, it's kind of funny to talk with you in this really formal way, since we've been talking to each other for a number of years now about various things. And it's particularly odd. I think our listeners, our friends and colleagues who are listening will appreciate how challenging it is to have a chat over Zoom,
Absolutely.
So I thought, just in the interest of trying to establish a conversation over Zoom, that we'd start with something a little juicier. So maybe, George, you could share with our friends and listeners today something about you that is not widely known, maybe an experience that was formative for you, that's helped to make you the person that you are today, or the kind of scientist who asks this kind of scientific questions that you ask today?
That's a fantastic question, Lisa. And some of this story you may know. I'm sure I've told you parts of this, but I think probably the one thing about my life that people don't know or may not have guessed, given the kind of work I do, is that, or maybe they have guessed because of the work I do, but I left home when I was quite young, about 17. I wouldn't necessarily say I had a troubled childhood or troubled adolescence, but I would say that I got into a lot of trouble in adolescence and afterwards. And I left home and went traveling and threw myself at the world, I suppose, at that age, with no intentions really of anything in higher education, no intentions of actually going to college, and wandered around for a while. And I think this was very formative. It was about 10 years before I did decide to go to college after high school. But this period was very formative in that many things happened and the world just opened up for me in a way that seemed, I don't know, magical, spiritual, words that I don't normally, or that are not normally associated with me. When I finally decided to go to school, I had, in a way, come through so many different types of events and had such a sense of what kind of world there is out there and what I could do in that world, and a sense of possibility, that I think that underlying almost attitude has really informed almost everything I've done since, whether I knew it or not. I don't think I was fully aware of that at the time. I just simply wanted to go to school. But there's this kind of past of mine that is almost a completely different chapter from the life I've had professionally. And sometimes I can hardly remember that I was the same person. But that's really a kind of piece of me that not everybody knows about.
And if it's not too personal a question, what caused you to leave home? Was it that you were irritated with your parents, or that you were just independent-minded and you wanted to kind of explore things on your own, or what was the...
Well, that is a personal question.
Well, then you don't have to answer it then.
I would be happy to answer it. I think I grew up, well, I have a lot of perspective on this now, but I think I grew up in a way that wasn't, which is, I think, common with a lot of kids that age. I didn't have much of a fit with the environment I was growing up in. I was interested in art. I was very intellectual and reading a lot, and I didn't quite fit in the context of where I was growing up. And there was a big mismatch there, without getting into too many details of that nature. But part of me was just, in a sense, bursting to go out and do things. I have a vivid memory, actually. And I don't know, maybe I've told you this, Lisa, that when I was maybe 10, I decided that I would need to start sleeping without a pillow, because I was going to be sleeping in fields someday, and I would need to know how to sleep without a pillow. And I've thought about that a lot, because, of course, I ended up sleeping in fields all the time, and in a tent, or just by a fire by a woodside or a creek or something in the travels I had. There was always a sense I was going to go out and do these things when I was young. And also, there was a very personal issue, which my father had a heart attack when he was quite young, and I was quite young, and he was far too young to have a heart attack. And he'd had several heart attacks. And he was, I think, very stressed in his life. And as a child, I remember vividly thinking, I'm not going to let this happen in my life. There's a better way to live, and I'm going to go out and find that life. So this was sort of a strangely driving thing, even when I was quite young.
So it sounds like you were pretty independent-minded in some sense, even when you were a little kid, by your description. And being independent-minded in this way, really an independent thinker, the kind of thinker who often feels like they don't fit their environment very well, that's a hard road to take when you're a scientist. It's a hard attitude to have, or a hard road to follow when you're a scientist. I think most scientists think they follow it, but probably fewer do than who actually believe that they do.
Well, I think that that's very true. And I think in science, in the research world, in academia, if you follow where your heart takes you, for lack of a better word, if you follow the ideas that really motivate you, the ideas you want answers to, not the ideas that will get your promotion, not the ideas that will be published in the best journal, not the ideas that will get you some attention, the ideas you really want answers to, it can be a very lonely road, because often the answers are not what the rest of the profession expects. They're not popular answers, or even popular questions at times, and that can be lonely, and it also can have career consequences. And early in my career, I think there were quite a few career consequences in that regard. A sense of, this is not getting me career-wise where I would love to be, except For me, it was not much of a choice. I had questions to answer.
Right. And do you feel like you've answered those questions?
I do in many ways. Yeah. I mean, I feel like some of the basic questions I've been tracking down, I've come up with answers that I can live with. They're not fully answered because, of course, the minute you answer a question, 18 other questions trickle open, and this an endless chase. But I've taken the sort of the questions I've had, I think, much farther than I really even imagined I would. So I'm very proud of that, and I'm very happy with where those questions have taken me. And that's incredibly satisfying. I think you know that as well. I know you know that because you've done things in your career like this, where you've taken what we know to a new direction. But there's something more satisfying than just about anything else in this profession.
That's true. So can you share with us one example, maybe from your work on, well, there are a number of topics, but can you share one example of a personal triumph, a question that was really pressing for you and you felt like you answered it in a way that you can live with?
Yes. What comes to mind, which is probably the most straightforward answer, is early in my career, I began to, really, this is the work on resilience that I've done. And early in my career, I began to see that people were much more robust, much more capable of enduring all kinds of adversities than was believed, really, both in the profession and in the general public. And so we began to pursue that. I began to pursue that. And the evidence almost immediately began to pile up to affirm that viewpoint. And that was one of the viewpoints that I think was rather easily ignored. In fact, earlier in my career, that idea that people were actually resilient, I began to do that work with bereavement, and then it spread into the world of trauma. And the research we were doing was showing basically that most people are able to cope fairly well with these aversive events, these events that nobody wants to happen. That's usually the way I think about loss and trauma and such things. That is the things that you really dread happening, you just don't want to happen, and they happen. We have no choice to deal with them. And most people are able to deal with those events pretty well. Not everybody, of course. Nobody. It's true that it's never true that everybody just passes through a highly averse event. There are always some casualties, but most people do. When I first began to do that, I even had many doubts, right? Because of course I was still a scientist even at that time, early in my career. We wanted to show that this was actually true, and we did lots of different things to try to drive home that conclusion, to test it, to look at it many different ways. And as we began to pile up the evidence, there was a lot of pushback.
Yeah, so I was going to say, I have a lot of questions about this because I think it's a really, really interesting story. And of course, when I was sort of foreshadowing this point, when I made this point about you challenging this view of human nature that is really embedded in, I don't think it's historically always been embedded in psychology, but maybe for the last couple of decades, this idea, I mean, we know adversity is really bad for young children, for example. It's a predictor of, illness later in life and so on. But that leads us to think about, leads people to assume that adversity in adulthood or exposure to adverse circumstances. I'm trying to avoid the use of the word trauma, since that will force me to ask you to define trauma, which then we could be here for 12 hours. But when you first saw evidence in the data that people were more resilient, and by that I don't mean that if I understand the findings, I mean, I've read a lot of your work, obviously. It's not that people don't feel distressed or suffer, affectively suffer. It's that it's the functionality of their lives isn't demolished in the way that we might expect. And I guess I wonder what happened if you can remember, when you first saw the first evidence that things were not going the way that you expected, and that people really were not destroyed by adverse circumstances, even really, really, heart-wrenching circumstances. What did you think? Did you think, there's something wrong with my study? Or did you think, wow, this is remarkable, I wonder or did you think like this is an unusual sample? Or did you think, wow, I'm really discovering something here?
Well, there was some element of surprise and at least some part of me not being surprised. I mean, in part of what a component of what I mentioned earlier of my own life experience, where I came through many things, and I won't go into it. It's a long story, but I've had many experiences where I could have died easily, and some what would count as traumatic events when I was wandering around being a foolish young guy. So part of me knew that there were lots of things that I'd gone through, and I came out okay. But part of it was also the method we use. And to this day, I still do this. Now, of course, lots of the studies I've been doing in more recent years, we get mountains of data, we do whatever else we can do. We do experimental paradigms, you get the data, and your data are all you have. Your data are your story. But when I first began to do this work, first on bereavement and then on traumatic events and other kinds of highly aversive events, we always built in, and we still do this to some extent, we always build in these very intensive interviews where we ask people open-ended questions. It's structured. I've developed a protocol for this where we ask people to tell us about their experience. In whatever words they have, we tell them, we're not going to say much. We want to hear what's going on for you, what this is like for you, because we don't know everything. And we did this initially in part because we wanted to get the data, in part because people like to tell their stories. But doing those interviews and sitting with people who ultimately were resilient and watching them, become very upset and then shift almost instantly to a smile or a laugh, and then to continue on, and then at the end of the interview to be basically fine, okay. And I knew that those people were doing fine in their life. They were functioning in their life. To be able to see that, to be able to see people in these studies also really brought it home in a way that made it less surprising. We were watching people one at a time come in the lab and show us just how resilient they were. So this kind of added up to a larger picture. And part of it was, when I began to look at the literature, I came a little bit out of left field into this area, particularly bereavement. I had not really had any intention of studying bereavement at any point until like 5 minutes before I was studying bereavement. And it just so happened that I was deciding to shift my research topic right after I finished graduate school to something more commensurate, something more compatible with the clinical side of myself and the applied aspect of my training, because I had a PhD in clinical psychology. And I was offered a position to study bereavement. And at first I thought that was really not a very good idea. I thought I wasn't interested. But when I began to look at the bereavement literature, I kind of quickly began to realize that this literature is really out of date. And it couldn't possibly be true that human beings could be as fragile as this literature suggested, because we wouldn't be here, because everybody loses a loved one many times in their life usually. So that kind of got me going right then and there, that there's probably a lot more to see here than the traditional ideas would suggest. And then, of course, we did the studies and we found people were even more resilient than we thought. And of course, the science part of me kicked in. So we wanted to make sure that this wasn't, a spurious result. So we built in other ways of testing the same idea. And then it grew from there, but the momentum kind of kicked in and carried us along at that point.
So how did you decide to study bereavement? What was you said you didn't decide until 5 minutes before you did it. So what happened in those 5 minutes that led you to that path?
Right. Well, I'd been studying really, I guess I was doing experimental cognitive personality research. I don't know, something along. I was doing a lot of experimental work, And I was getting more and more focused on the paradigms themselves rather than the ideas I was trying to capture. And I thought, well, that's fine that people do this kind of work, but it wasn't the kind of work I wanted to do necessarily. So I began to look more broadly. There was a chance I was going to go to Cambridge, to the MRC, and do some work with these wonderful people whose careers I've been following. And they had invited me to come join them in Cambridge. But then I thought, this is not really the direction I want to go. I need to go even more toward an applied direction. And then I was offered a position with Marty Horowitz in San Francisco. And Marty at the time was one of the pioneers of trauma research. And he had the funds, and he had a setup to do this large-scale bereavement study. And he offered me the position to run this study, to just kind of take it over, which meant carte blanche, and lots of resources. And as I said, I really thought the idea was not such an interesting idea. And I think somewhere when I went out to San Francisco to visit, first of all, San Francisco is an absolutely lovely city. And I had just been married, and I thought this would be a great place to start our marriage. But I think somewhere in that visit, in those 2 or 3 days, I looked at the literature more closely, and I realized, okay, there's something wrong with this literature. It needs to be updated. Somebody needs to import psychology into this literature, modern psychology. And I had the resources to do it, and suddenly I got very excited by that possibility that I could test this idea. And I think right then and there, in just those couple of days, I decided, okay, I'm going to come out and do this.
I think most people probably don't know. In fact, I think you and I just figured this out recently, that I had applied. I was on clinical internship in 1991, and I had applied to that same program that Marty was running. And while I was on clinical internship, I received 40 manuscripts to read and summarize into a paper. And this was this was part of my application process. I don't know if he had you do the same kind of thing, but I looked at that in the middle of a huge caseload and also running experiments simultaneously at the University of Manitoba, where I was doing my internship. And I thought, no, that's not happening. I'm not applying I'm not going to take this any further. And it's so funny to think about, you can't really do the counterfactuals, but it's funny to think about what would have happened if I had done that. Or I guess we ended up meeting each other a couple of years later.
Yeah, not long after that. And many of the people that were in that team in San Francisco have become lifelong friends, and they're all over the world now. So you and I had become very good friends, and we didn't work together in that postdoc, but there was something in the air, I think, maybe. Yeah, it's funny.
For our viewers, I'll just say that how George and I met was, I think it was 1993, and I think it was an APS, maybe
in
APS
Toronto.
or APS, or we were in Toronto, which is where I'm from actually. But and George had given a brilliant talk, and we were walking. I can't even remember what street it was on, but some big street in Toronto. And I saw him, and I didn't know him at all, but he gave this amazing talk, and so I just walked right up to him and said, "Hi, I'm Lisa Feldman. What an amazing talk you just gave. I'm so pleased to meet you." And then that was it. We became friends.
I'm so glad you did. And I remember you had a white dress on, and it was sunny. I don't know the streets in Toronto, but yeah,
I do, but I don't remember what street it was. But it was that I was wearing a white dress. It's true. Yeah. Anyways.
Although I don't think I remember giving a good talk. So I like your version a lot better.
It was so good that it, my sentiment changed immediately from envy to awe. So that I think at that stage in my career, that says something. Gosh, there are a lot of questions that I really want to ask. Some of them are more philosophical, and some of them are more kind of, demographic and kind of factual, like your sort of your life story. Maybe we'll come back to the philosophical ones later. That's probably a nice way to end our chat today. But so you started working on the bereavement project. You discovered that bereavement didn't really necessarily involve people completely falling apart at the loss of one of the greatest losses you could experience, right? Which is the loss of a loved one. And this set you on a path that really has, I think, defined your career in the sense that, you've done some things that are somewhat different in the manner of conducting your career than I think other colleagues. For example, I mean, you do pay very, very close attention to data, and you are definitely willing to throw caution to the wind and pursue a puzzle. And you tend to use very large data sets about real world events that are captured. The data are usually captured in the field or, as close to the field as one can get. And so was that deliberate? Were those things deliberate on your part? Were they thoughtful and planful, or were you just sort of following your nose?
No, I mean, I think that was quite deliberate, partly because it was the only way to answer those questions. And this is actually something I think about a lot, especially when I do a literature review and I look at what we have in our field. So it really to answer the questions about how people cope with these highly aversive events, there's no other way to do it other than to get there are large data sets and they're moderate-sized data sets where you follow people for many years, and that's primarily the work I've done is what we recruit 300 people, say, and try to follow them for 5 years or 3 years. But the study will take us 5 years to complete. And it's very labor intensive, bringing people into the lab, following them over time. When I first began to do that, really hardly anybody was doing that kind of work. And I still remember that we would publish a paper, and then we would try to publish another paper from the study. And sometimes the journals would say, "You've already published a paper from this study. Why are you trying to publish another paper?" And I had to argue that, because I took 5 years to collect a massive amount of data, and I intend to publish lots of different pieces of it, because it really wasn't a well-known approach in those days. And that took really years. It took years, and it's a difficult thing. And I made the deliberate choice, definitely, to do that kind of research, and we got the grants to do research that way. But it's hard. Most of my students would work on these studies for several years, and they'd go off in their own career before anything was even published from these studies. The next crop would maybe publish from that study. So we developed, a kind of a way where new students would publish from the previous stuff we have, et cetera. But, I firmly believe this. If you want to answer a question, you have to answer it. You have to find the method to give you to answer, or you have to find a method that'll ask the question you want to answer. And that's not often the case, unfortunately. It's very easy to say with a clinical population or a population going through something different, to give them some questionnaires and publish a paper. But that approach, which is very common, doesn't really tell us much of anything. But it's a never-ending task. So after we published, say, 20 years of these longitudinal studies, then we began to realize that this only got us so far. And now what we need are prospective studies. We need studies where we can have data on people before anything happens and then follow them into the future after the event happens. And that seemed impossible when we first began to do it. It really seemed impossible. But I thought, we have to find a way to do this. There must be a way. And eventually we did it. And then eventually we did it again, and now we do it all the time. We just found the ways to do it.
How do you do it?
Well, you have to either get, there are lots of data sets that follow people for years, national data sets, right? So you can get a preliminary answer that way, where you just find the event in the data set. You have the data before and after. I have a vivid memory of when Hurricane Sandy hit New York. And I had been funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and some other people were funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And it was really to look at how resilience works. And we had a big meeting of all the people that were funded, and a group of researchers came to the meeting. I won't tell you where they're from because I don't necessarily need to identify them. But they had come to New York to survey the entire city about Hurricane Sandy. And I remember having a conversation with them, and I thought, this is fantastic. So how did you get data before Sandy? And they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, how did you get the data before Sandy so you know what changed? And they said, well, we didn't do that, and we're not going to do that. That's too hard. How would you do that? And then I thought, but then what's, I don't want to sound too critical, but then I thought, what's the point of just giving people a survey right now? You get a little bit of information, but what is this really going to tell you? Because it's all correlational at one point in time. And, that was as far as that conversation went. But lo and behold, a year later, I had actually done this very thing because I knew about somebody in a nearby area that had been collecting data before Sandy. And that person and I put it together a grant. And because of Hurricane Sandy, resources opened up. So we got a little bit more money to continue after Hurricane Sandy. And we put in some new measures. We put in some stuff about what people are experiencing. We found we could get data on their quality of life and the neighborhood they lived in based from the state records. And we put together all this data. We ended up actually getting a data set that went back before 2008, before the economic downturn of 2008. So we followed people from before the economic downturn, measured the impact of the economic downturn, then Hurricane Sandy, and then afterwards. And, we were able to do it just because we decided why that's what we have to do. And I firmly believe that. If we want to answer a question, instead of just, throwing out some simple measures and, publishing a paper, because we can do that, we should really be trying to figure out how to really ask, how to find a method that allows us to ask the question we really want to answer.
Yeah. It sounds really, I even though I know the story to some extent of your career, it's just listening to you describe it to me sounds very, very inspirational. And I guess one of the things that that I'm concerned about, I think that a lot of us are concerned about, are about young people and about the incentive structure that they have to exist in.
Yeah.
And in order to be successful. And now I'm going to say something slightly cynical. If we were alone over coffee, I'd probably be way more cynical, but we're being taped, so I have to temper what I say. In our field, to some extent, publications are like a currency. They're a currency that you exchange for things like, tenure and grant money and notoriety and so on. But you're describing a career where those publications certainly have come to you, and you have been extremely successful. But there must have been times at the beginning, and maybe even further along, where you're really bucking many trends. The questions that you're asking are in violation of deeply held beliefs about the way that humans work. You're not using laboratory methods as a dominant strategy, empirical strategy, the kind of simple, stimulus response, experiments that are well controlled. You're using very large data sets that about real world events. Sometimes you have to, in order to construct a reasonable data set, you have to put together data from multiple sources, which involves coordinating large groups of people. That's something that is more common now to do, but it was not a common thing to do 20 years ago when you were doing it, when you started doing it. And so I wonder, there must have been moments that you yourself felt, were there moments that you yourself as a young scientist felt that, how resilient were you? I guess is what I'm saying. Lisa, did you have moments
absolutely.
where
you... It's a fantastic question. I do experimental work as well. And I
didn't mean to imply that you did.
Yeah. No, and so this produces publications as well. But no, you're absolutely right, and it was very difficult. I think probably I was more driven to do things that way than most people, and I think I did pay the price. The price was a sense of I mentioned this before, a sense of loneliness and a sense of everybody wants to be recognized. And for a good chunk of the first part of my career, there was almost no recognition. And that's really hard. There's a sense of it, especially, when we first began to document how resilient people were, we published these papers in top journals and they had no impact at all. And in fact, a very typical citation
When you
pattern
say no impact, you mean they weren't being cited, or
they were not being cited. They were not having they were not moving the needle at all. And in fact, if I looked at the site, when I look at the citation, histograms of my earlier papers, they look like they're low, and that eventually they start to go up, and then they get cited a lot 10 or 15 years later, which is not the typical citation pattern, right? It takes a long time for them to catch on. And that was most definitely hard. And I did, I think I'm probably making this sound a little bit more idealized than it is, but I did a lot of whining and complaining about that time. And I certainly wanted more recognition than I was getting, but more than anything else, I wanted people to acknowledge what I felt like I had done, and that didn't happen for a long time. And as I said, I think I was particularly driven in my career. But there is a price to pay for it. On the other hand, if the benefit of that to offset that cost is when something you really want to know bears fruit. The fruit is so incredibly rewarding because you have the sense of, I found something that nobody else knows, or I have got us a little bit closer to the truth. Now, right after 9/11, sometime when we began to do more trauma research, I published a paper that had a fairly big impact. But in writing that paper, that was a time when I felt like I really need to say this. I really need to make this point. This was really about resilience and trauma. And I published this paper in American Psychologist. And I made a little sign for myself. I'm almost embarrassed to tell you this because it's a little corny. But I made a little sign and I put it above my office door that said, "It's not about money, it's not about fame, it's about getting closer to the truth." And I put it on my office door. Really, nobody saw it. It was up high. And, essentially I was telling them, I don't know why I put money in there, because no money was coming my way in any way at that time. But I think the point that I was making for myself was, if I write this paper thinking, will somebody take it? Will it go in a top journal? Will it get me attention? Will it be a big splash? I'm not going to write the paper I need to write. And I felt like I really need to write this paper now, talking about the work we've done and explaining what it meant for how we can think about traumatic events. It really was a kind of a, if I can use an overused cliche, I was trying to shift the paradigm. And I wasn't going to write that paper if I focused too much on my career or accolades. And ironically, that paper brought me a lot of attention and accolades and things. But I knew if I thought about that, I wouldn't have written the paper. So it's there's a dialectic tension that I think has to exist between these things. And we can push it either way.
There are so many things that you just said that I can really resonate to, and I think that a lot of people can. So you can't see, but over here where I have my computer, I have actually little notes to myself that are these little inspirational things. I think because, they do actually help. I mean, science is a social activity. And the validity of science, Naomi Oreskes, a historian of science, wrote this wonderful book recently called Why Trust Science? And the punchline really is that you can trust what you learn from science, because when people with very diverse backgrounds, who have very diverse points of view, all come to consensus around a point, then you have more confidence that point, might be closer to the truth.
Yeah.
Scientists we're really careful about using the F word, right? Like, we don't like the word fact. It's like a scary word that, we want to wrap it in probability and context and so on. But exactly. I know. What sounds like weasel words to the average person those are like very comforting and important words to scientists. But my point is that, that when what nobody seems to write about or talk about are those moments in a career which sometimes can last what seem like a very interminably long duration, where you are going against the grain, where there isn't consensus around your work. And if there is, it's that you're wrong. Everybody else telling you you're wrong. And somehow you have to find the strength to keep your eye on the ball. And what that often means is not tuning out the noise of dissent. so that you can really try to follow the questions that are important to you. Not tune out everything, because other people's criticisms are often really, really useful in showing you where you might be going wrong. But there is this tension between...
Yeah. And I think that there are two kinds of pushback that one gets. One is being ignored, which I mentioned. That's primarily what I experienced, which hurts. But I think aggressive criticism is probably even harder. Because it really gets under your skin.
Yeah, I would say, I don't know about you, but did it matter to you whether it was, did it matter when you say aggressive criticism? Was it criticism of your ideas or of your work or of your analysis or of you as a person? So oftentimes, you'll read things that I'm just saying, hypothetically, of course, I'm not really drawing on personal experience when I say this. That people will, your colleagues will say, "Oh, you have an axe to grind," or you are, drawing a straw man and knocking it down, or really these are they're directed really at your intentions rather than at your methods. Or so. I guess I'm wondering, was that a distinction that you could make, or that you did make, or did it just feel sometimes there was just so much criticism that it just felt, over like a wall?
Well, it's interesting because in the trajectory of my career, the criticism is the real overt criticism has come more recently. When I think when my work began to catch on after a long time, and then it began to be accepted, that's when the criticism started to pour in. A lot of it wasn't aimed at me personally, I don't think. I mean, there were criticisms of the methods and criticisms of the thrust of what I was doing. At least I never took them as criticisms of me. I hadn't thought of it that way. But they were definitely criticisms of the ideas. And to this day, people still will come up to me and say, you're just wrong. That's just wrong. Sometimes even prominent people have said that to me, that's just wrong. And which is a strange criticism because there's no reason given. But I
would say, George, that in an era where our field is very, very worried about replicability and so on, that your research career is a real triumph, because first of all, the patterns that you find, the resilience patterns that you find, generalize across many, many studies, across many, many different types of adversity. So the patterns are extremely robust, right? And it really has had an impact on the direction of the field. So in the end, it's a great example of how science works. I mean, in this way that Naomi Oreskes actually says. I mean, there are some people who disagree with you, but the weight of the findings is incredibly powerful.
Oh, thank you. And that actually has been probably one of the more rewarding parts, because it's replicated, this sort of general pattern is replicated using other methods. It's not a method bound. And that has been very rewarding to see that. Yeah. I've explored other areas, and you mentioned flexibility in your introduction, and I do a lot of research on flexibility now, which is more experimental. And that in that domain, I find a lot more, I find that, I'm wrong sometimes, and, sometimes the direction we're going is off track, and we do a lot of correction, and that feels like more of a normative process.
Yeah. So maybe tell us about that. Tell us about, let's talk about one time in your career where, I'm sure if I talked to your wife, Paulette, she could tell me many times when you were wrong, but let's talk about your career
or my children.
And your children, even more so. Yeah. Let's not even go there, because, mine might come in and want to tell you all the ways in which I've been wrong too. But what's a time in your career where you've been wrong, like really not a little wrong, but like seriously wrong?
I don't know if this is completely a good answer to the question, but I had been studying bereavement and grief for a long time, and I continue to do so, even though I don't actually think of this as my major area of work anymore, because I've expanded into other areas and mostly traumatic, trauma and types of things. But there was a common finding that grief treatments weren't working very well. And one of the reasons was that treatments for grief was because they were targeting too broad of a scope. So there was a real need for a diagnosis of grief. And now I'm not a big fan of diagnoses at all. I'm not a big fan of the DSM or any of these diagnostic catalogs, because I think they're not very scientific. But I found myself arguing in favor of the DSM in the way the DSM conceptualized grief, because it basically said grief is really, it's probably depression and maybe some PTSD added for certain types of losses. And there was a movement to create a new grief diagnosis. And I found myself arguing. I was often invited to be a consultant on panels about this new diagnosis. And I found myself arguing that we didn't really need a new diagnosis. I even published a paper, I think, in the journal Clinical Psychology Review, arguing that we didn't need this diagnosis. What we have is fine. Grief is probably depression, maybe plus some, trauma symptoms in certain types of situations. And if people want to have a grief diagnosis, then let's see some convergent, let's see some incremental validity. Let's see some evidence that this is going to gain you something from what we already have. And I argued this fairly forcefully, because it seemed like the most logical conclusion. And I think at some point somebody said, well, I said, why don't we have evidence for incremental validity? And somebody said, well, why don't you do that? Which I found annoying at the time. But, and then I thought, well, I think I could do that. And so I actually had the data to do it. So I had a really nice, robust data set. And we looked and we found actually that the grief symptoms, we had a set of grief symptoms that they did a lot more over and above PTSD and depression. They showed robust incremental validity. And, at the time, I did this as rigorously as I could. I followed all the prescriptions for the most appropriate way to look at incremental validity. And grief was doing the grief symptoms were really doing a lot. I got another data set with a colleague who had different measures, different methods, but the same grief, depression, and PTSD. And again, we found that grief was really powerful in capturing something that these didn't capture. So we published a paper, and I basically said, I'm wrong, folks. This is very important. But I felt good about that because I was saying I was wrong, but then we were actually showing why then grief was important. So yeah, I was happy to do that.
Mm-hmm. It's always better if you show yourself to be wrong as opposed to somebody else shows you.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a good way to head it off.
So what, if you were going to list, it's always hard. I hate when people ask me this question, but if you were going to list like what research paper or book has most inspired you, or it can be in psychology or outside of psychology, what work? What scientific work or?
Let me answer with two then. Since you said outside of psychology.
Yeah, for sure.
First, in psychology, this is an old example, but and this was really not an empirical paper, but it was a paper by Scott Lilienfeld, who's always been one of my favorite people and always one of my heroes, and Howard Garb and James Wood, I think, were the other authors. And it was published in Psychological Science in the Public Interest, and it was about projective tests. And at the time, I'm clinically trained. You are clinically trained. I think that's a secret. I don't know if many people know. And at the time, projective tests were very, very prominent. They still are. And I had to learn them. I had to learn the Rorschach. And I'll just tell you, it's not so secret, but I really dislike the Rorschach. But in any case, projective tests, they're kind of pseudoscientific. And when somebody is, and I cut my teeth in this field really working with severely, people with severe psychopathology who were hospitalized against their will. And I was in a program to get them out of the hospital. And I know how powerful, and I saw many people got better right away when we took them out of the hospital. This was the deinstitutionalization movement happened in the 80s. So something like the Rorschach is, or other projective tests, you have the answers and a person is having psychological problems and you hold up the magic ink blots or any other kind of a measure, and they know that you have the answers and they better get the right answer or you're going to influence their life or you can actually you can influence what happens with their life. And that's a completely loaded situation, and it's not a very good situation. And there was a sort of psychological, pseudoscience veneer over these tests that really bothered me when I was learning these things, when I was forced to learn these things. And now this is a sort of a bold statement on my part, and I know I might upset somebody by saying this, but I really found this not a good situation. I thought this was basically a wrong way to proceed. And Lilienfeld and James Wood and Scott Lilienfeld, James Wood and Howard Garb published this paper basically saying, what evidence is there for these measures? And they basically showed essentially the emperor had no clothes. And I just thought that was such a powerful thing. And it showed me, I was still pretty young in my career, but it showed me at the time that you can do this. You can actually take on a very firmly believed idea and just say, what evidence do we have for this? What is actually there? So I found that very powerful.
That's a great story. I think it's easy to look at a lot of the tests that exist even now, and tests that are used to make decisions about people's outcomes, not just in a clinic, but in industry and in educational settings, and ask a similar question. That's why Psychological Science in the Public Interest, in particular, as a journal, is a really great journal. It does a huge public service.
Yeah.
And having been part of a team that worked on a paper for them, the editorial board always requires that people from different points of view, disagreeing points of view, work together. And that is a really great, in my experience, that was a really great experience. So I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you about an aspect of your life that maybe some people don't know about, which is that you are a very gifted artist, and you could have gone to art school and could have made a career as an artist, but I'm imagining you chose not to, that it wasn't just a happenstance that you became a scientist. So I'm wondering if you could tell us how you developed your artistic ability and what made you decide to become a scientist rather than an artist professionally.
Wow. I love you for asking me that question, because I love to talk about art, and I have so many opportunities. I love you for lots of things, Lisa, but I love you for asking that question. Art is one of the things, I should say, painting and drawing is one of the things, probably is the only thing in my life I could just simply do. I decided one day, I think I was 15 or something, and I thought, I wonder if I could draw, something. And I remember it. Hours passed, and I made a drawing. I don't remember what. I think it was a portrait of somebody, and I thought it was pretty good, and I was very thrilled with it. I thought, wow, this time just flew. I was absorbed in this, and I began to do artwork passionately in those days, which led me to become a sign painter. When I was traveling around, not going to college, I painted signs for money. But I did artwork off and on, and some of it I was very happy with, others not so much. And then I think later I began to do art very seriously. And right around the same time, I decided to go to college and then into graduate school. And kind of at the very same time, perhaps because my life was opening up, perhaps because I felt the confidence, but I began to show my work in galleries. And I was very happy with that work. I was doing figurative work. So I was doing portraiture and landscapes. And this would have been, I don't want to date myself too much, but this would have been in the late 1980s. At that time, figurative work was completely unpopular. Everything was really abstract and conceptual. And I realized at the time, one, that I would be miserable in the art world if I had pursued it. I had really no intentions of ever going to art school per se. I really had no interest in ever having any kind of formal training in art. I'm not sure why. So I really had no intentions of ever really getting formal training. It wasn't anything I was interested in. But for me, art was just something, it just completely grabbed me. It completely absorbed me, and I felt tremendous amount of passion for it. But I think as the further I pursued it, the more I thought I would not be happy doing art as a career if I could actually do that. And I think part of the reason was because, as I mentioned, that I felt like I would have to somehow make a living in this crazy art world, and I think the art world is still quite crazy. But my work in psychology was blossoming then too, and I would look like I would have a career in psychology if I wanted to do that. And I decided that that psychology would provide me with a career that would be very creative, but also kind of some more manageable in terms of structure and a career I could see actually happening. For years, I thought about the fact that I didn't pursue art. I think I no longer do that, and I continue to paint. I no longer, worry. I no longer bemoan that part of my career.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, are you working on anything now, or?
I was painting a lot recently, some landscapes. I went to Sicily to see where my family is from, where my grandfather and grandmother were from, and I was overwhelmed by that. So I did some painting in Sicily. And I was painting a lot until recently, and now I'm writing a book, which I'm just about finished writing, a book, a trade book for the general public, and that's taken every ounce of my strength and time. So for the time being, I put the painting on hold, but I will get back to it.
And your new book is about?
The new book is about really integrating resilience and flexibility. So the idea is that we can't really, we know people are resilient, and I've puzzled over this for a long time. We know people are resilient, but we're not very good at predicting who's resilient and who's not. We can identify lots of predictors of resilience. We can identify the magic traits of resilience. You see just recently, this has been in the news again, the 5 or the 7 magic traits of resilient people. But those traits that often get listed, those characteristics, are all very small effects, and they don't predict much. And I've puzzled over this for a long time. And I see the mechanisms of flexibility that I've been studying in the laboratory and in other ways, and in questionnaire studies now and in larger end studies, as a way to solve that problem. There's a bit of a paradox there. We know people are resilient, we know it predicts resilience, but we can't predict it. And the book is about how we solve that paradox in a sense. And that's all I'm going to say, because the book is the answer.
Maybe you could just give one tidbit away, because this is such a difficult time. We're all dealing with so much.
Well, I guess I've actually said this early on in the COVID crisis. APS asked me to kind of list my thoughts about this. And basically, it's about all the behaviors that we can do at any time. No behavior is always functions. No behavior is always effective. Everything has costs and benefits, and this goes way back. I often tell the story about the peacock when I give lectures on this work, that peacocks are these beautiful creatures, and Darwin hated peacocks. There's a great quote from Darwin about written to Asha Gray, who is the biologist who reviewed The Origin of Species when it came out. And he said to him about a year later, "Every time I see a peacock, it makes me sick." Something like that. And the reason is he couldn't explain it. With the survival of the fittest doesn't explain why on earth a peacock would survive, because it's such an unfit creature in a sense. It's got a huge tail, and it's a big meaty bird. And he resolves that with sexual selection, with the idea that the big meaty tail and the attention-getting quality is what allows it to it mates. It works for reproducing through sexual selection. But that builds in the costs and benefits right there. And everything has costs and benefits. So really, resilience is about knowing what to do in what situation, the right behavior in the right time, in the right situation. And we have to make those choices, and we have to work that out and actually do it and correct. And there's a process there. And that process loosely is what I call flexibility. And so the book is really the details of that. It sounds very simple, and the details are actually quite intricate. And that's really what the book is about, how we do that, how we somehow find our way to that process. But what's interesting about this idea is that it's kind of a different view, a kind of a reimagining of what trauma is, because these things happen to us and we tend to think of them as overwhelming, traumatic, leading to PTSD, et cetera. And in fact, we go through these processes where we struggle through these events pretty early on and we find our solutions. So the book is really, or in my work of the last 10 years or so, has been about how we do that. How we find those solutions.
Mm-hmm. And so how would you, if you were going to redefine trauma then?
Well, I don't use the word trauma really in my work. I use the word I always use a slightly more cumbersome word, potential trauma, or PTE, potentially traumatic event, because all events are potentially traumatic. And we get upset when these things happen to us. We definitely get upset. We definitely struggle. But it usually doesn't last very long. So we're doing something during that process that allows us to move beyond those events. And I think that's extremely underappreciated, that process. There's been very little attention to it, but I think that's what humans do.
Right, so resilience isn't not being bothered or perturbed by adversity. It's having a big enough toolbox, or maybe a big enough set of options to craft a solution for yourself.
That's one part of it. The repertoire part is one part of it. There's also we really need to understand what's happening to us first, and I call that context sensitivity. This is the work we've published over the last 10 or 15 years, that we need to read the situations. We need to pay attention, and we don't actually like to pay attention to these things. They're these horrible events. We really want to push them away. So we need to be motivated. So we need to, when there's a mindset involved, which I call the flexibility mindset, where we actually engage with a situation just enough to sort of, understand what is it that's really happening to us? What's the problem here? What do I need to do? And we need to figure that out. And then we also the toolbox comes into play then. What do we have in the toolbox, or what do we have that we can actually use? Because most people can't do everything. So from what we're good at, what would work in this situation? And we try something, and sometimes we're just wrong. So we have this corrective process as well. And we cycle through this many times.
One of the things that I learned actually when I was treating girls who had suffered sexual abuse as children. So I was treating college students. This is when I was, as you say, a clinician back in another life. One of the things I learned was that when people feel victimized by adversity, when they are traumatized by an adversity, they're victimized twice, because first they're not responsible for the event that occurred to them that is so adverse. And then second, at some point they realize, and that could be within the first month, or it could be, months or years later, they realize that the only person who can really clean up all the crap that has resulted from that adversity is them. And to many people, that feels unfair, and it is unfair. Nonetheless, sometimes things are your responsibility, not because you're culpable for the cause, but because you're the only one who can fix them.
Yeah.
And that's I think, a lesson that, it shows up, or it comes up, or it's relevant in a lot of the things that we study. Many things that have to do with personal responsibility for your actions, even in cases where it's not as profound or serious as dealing with adversity.
Well, I do think I agree, and I think that partly the way that we study these things, and partly the way they're presented in the media, as if they just sort of happen. And the idea of the magic traits of the 7 magic traits of resilient people, suggests that you have these things and then you're done. You don't have to worry anymore because you have these traits. But every one of these things that we know, leads to resilient outcomes. You have to actually engage in it. You have to use it. A great example is optimism. Optimism sounds like, well, I'm optimistic about the future, so it'll be fine. But optimistic people work really hard. They think the future will be okay, and optimism is a motivator. That's really what its primary function is. When you're optimistic, you say, well, it'll be okay, but I have to get there, right? I'll do what's necessary. And the research shows that optimistic people, they're healthier because they take care of themselves, not because they're magically healthy. So I think all of these things are about being engaged and accepting the challenge in a sense, very much so.
Do you think, one thing that really strikes me about your work is there's a real, I don't want to say distinction, but there's a real important, distinction. There's something really important about distinguishing suffering and action and being functionally effective in your life. So, we live in a culture that strongly prizes mentalizing things. We infer underlying psychological causes for actions. We treat the failure to mentalize and infer a thought or a feeling behind an action. We give that diagnoses. When someone comes to a doctor and says they have a stomach ache, instead of saying they're anxious, we diagnose that as somatization. We really strongly believe structurally as a culture in the causal importance of unseen internal thoughts and feelings. And there's a force in economics to redefine productivity by happiness and so on. But your work on resilience and flexibility suggests that people could suffer and they can struggle and that suffering and struggling is part of the process of being resilient. And I just think it's interesting because in psychology, there's always been this somewhat uneasy tension between, do we study the mind? Do we study behavior? And I always think of, from a scientific standpoint, from a predictive coding standpoint, experience is a consequence of behavior. It's not really the other way around. So to me, they're tightly wound. And so maybe we shouldn't be focusing so much on happiness as an index of well-being. Maybe we should be focusing on how much people engage with discomfort and struggle with it in order to get to better behavioral solutions for things. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think the world differs greatly in those kinds of ideas. I know there are culture differences even in how people feel comfortable with sadness, right?
Oh, for sure. I'm talking about Western, Western.
But, I think that, if we think about potentially traumatic events and, these things that happen to us, there is definitely pain involved in those events. But the pain is usually, it's somewhat short-lived, but we can't, our bodily, the mechanisms we have to deal with stress require threat, right? You have to feel like you're going to be overwhelmed in order to activate those systems. And without it, you can't function. And so, there was a classic misunderstanding of that with something called psychological debriefing about 10, 15 years ago, where, mental health professionals would flood a site of a disaster or a potential trauma to to take care of everybody right within the first day. And it turned out, that I think a lot of the people doing that kind of work felt it was actually helpful. And even people receiving it thought it must be helpful. But it turned out that it wasn't helpful and generally harmful to people. There were pretty good evidence that you could actually harm people with that kind of debriefing, because it was interrupting that relatively short-term pain and distress people were experiencing, which was that was the process of them kind of going through what they'd been through and having, intrusive memories that are disturbing, because that's how we sort of catalog them. We work out what they tell us, right? And so I think the idea that somehow, I've never understood the happiness thing at all, since you brought that up, of why we would ask people whether they're happy. Because if they ask me whether I'm happy, I have no idea, to be honest with you.
I was brought up in a Jewish family, so there's just no way that I could see happiness as being, but
who can be happy?
Well, I think meaning is, there is this whole literature distinguishing, hedonics and eudaimonics and so on. And I wasn't really meaning to criticize the happiness, the efforts at happiness. I more was talking about the priority of feeling over action, which I know sounds funny coming from somebody who studies what I study, but but feeling bad isn't always a bad thing.
And if feeling bad sometimes gets you to where you no longer have to feel bad anymore. Most definitely. Yeah. And I think it's all in the grand scheme of things, when something really undesirable happens, it's happened to you and it's not going to go away. And you have to kind of get down to it and deal with it. But if you do that and you deal with that difficult moments, generally then we get up to the other side of it. Yeah.
One last question, George. We've already mentioned that, it's a tough time for young scientists right now for all the usual reasons. And then there are the additional ones that I don't have to mention. But we both have a stream of students and postdocs and people we mentor. And there are a larger community of young scientists who are listening to our conversation. And so I'm wondering, what advice might you have for young scientists today to be resilient or successful in their careers?
That's a great question. My answer typically to a question like that is really centers around following what you're interested in, following the questions you have. We've already talked a little bit about how that can make for difficulties in one's career. And I think that's definitely true. But I think if you don't, I think first of all, one should be very clear with a chosen career that this is really what you want. So science is about, a scientific career, an academic career, a research career is really, it's really about solving pieces of a puzzle. Most of the time, it's Thomas Kuhn said this very well in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that scientists are puzzle solvers, right? So if you better know that you like to solve puzzles, and I don't mean crossword puzzles, although crossword puzzles are okay, but I mean, trying to understand something and put the pieces together. That said, though, then I think there's a question of how much you pursue the big questions that you want. And, sometimes those big questions take a long time to I think, hone into a form that you can actually answer them. But I think it's a much more, so I stick to the idea that the best career. And the advice I would give is to follow your heart, follow what really moves you, what you really want to know. One doesn't necessarily need to throw caution to the wind and ignore all other aspects of a successful career. There are incremental contributions that make for publications that get you out there. And there's grant money to be had, but all these things they're on a continuum. One can be enormously successful in getting grants by pursuing the grants that are available and the questions that the grants are asking to be answered. But you can also find funding for the things you want to know about. And it's the same thing. You can publish the things you want to know about, and you can come to answers. So I tend to advise taking that approach to a career, really looking for what you want to know and pursuing it, with the caveat that you do have to also have a career and do the things that are necessary.
Just one more question then. So is that what you would tell your younger self if you could reach back in time and talk to young George?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Be younger self, meaning the same basic character that I have now. So yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, George, thank you so much for talking today.
And Lisa, thank you so much for doing this interview and giving us this chance to talk like this.